Boldwood presents My Mother's Lies, written by Diane Saxon, and read by Sophie Dora Hall and Charlotte Worthing. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Present day, Sunday, 30th of June, 2024, 3:30 p.m. Siobhan. Siobhan Martin reversed her car into the only space she could find in the Wrexham Mylor Hospital car park, breathing in as though that would allow her car more room. Her mirrors skimmed through the neighbouring car's mirrors by a hair's breadth, and she allowed herself to sigh out as she turned off the engine. Without aircon, the car filled with stifling heat as the sun beat through the windscreen. She edged open the driver's door and sucked in again, to squeeze herself out of the narrow gap. It seemed that in recent years, car parking spaces had become smaller, while cars were made larger all the time. She couldn't moan. Her own SUV was too big for one, but then she needed it to transport all the feed and bedding for the small holding she owned with her mum. Her mum, who was currently in hospital, having broken her hip when she slipped over in the chicken compound. The heat wave had baked the ground so hard that Siobhan heard the crack of her mum's hip as the woman went down. Frantic, Siobhan had called 999 and shielded her mum from the relentless sun with two large umbrellas and a sheet hung between them. Regardless of all the precautions she'd taken, her mum had still gone into shock and was severely dehydrated, as Siobhan had been advised to give her nothing until she'd been through the hospital A&E process, in case she went straight into surgery. Once she'd been assigned a bed to await her operation, which they'd delayed until the following morning, she'd been put on fluids. The last Siobhan had seen of her, she'd looked like a frail shadow of her former self. Siobhan pushed the driver's door closed, locked it, looped the strap of her handbag over her shoulder, and made her way towards the main entrance of the hospital. The light dress she'd slipped on after her shower an hour earlier already stuck to her, as sweat beaded across her skin, caused not only by the weather, but by panic and fear trembling through her veins. A sleepless night had also contributed to her sensitivity. As an estate agent, it wasn't always easy to work from home, but she'd managed to organise a couple of days where she could work flexible hours. After all, she didn't want to use up holiday allowances until her mum needed her back home. It wasn't as though she worked for a large practice with people who could fill in for her, and her boss was not exactly the most understanding. It should have been her weekend to work. All day Saturday and a half day on Sunday. Ivan Brown was the kind of person who expected his staff to trawl their way into the office, no matter how deep the snow or whether or not the car had broken down. During COVID, despite putting her on furlough, he'd requested that she go into the office every day, just to pick up the post and deal with it. Requested was not entirely correct. Demanded with some degree of aggression. What was she supposed to do? Lose her job? Siobhan had been contemplating a move, looking at options, but unless she moved to the city, there weren't that many vacancies she could apply for in her area of work. All the estate agents knew each other. Her application would hardly be a secret. That was the way it worked in Wales. That being said, Tracy Hartridge of Hartridge and Carlton had been making noises about Sean Carlton retiring soon. She'd also been hinting at taking on someone younger, more driven. Someone who could perhaps take over the practice when she wanted to retire. An exit strategy. It was a prospect Siobhan had been contemplating. Another year, and it was a possibility. Tracy was a nice woman, a good woman. Her clients came back to her time and time again. Her employees stayed. Always a good sign. In the meantime, Siobhan had yet to figure out how she was going to cope right now. Her mum was the one who looked after the animals on their small holding, as a rule. 3 pygmy goats, 2 donkeys, 42 chickens, 6 cats, and a dog. They'd have more dogs again soon, but they were waiting for the right ones from the rescue centre. ones that would fit in with their way of life. Siobhan's mum was 35 when Siobhan was born. Now 66, she had led a quiet life dedicated to her smallholding in the last few years. It seemed her mum preferred to keep out of the limelight, spending her time in the company of animals rather than humans. Of the 42 chickens, 2 were cockerels, neither like Siobhan. Truth be told, she wasn't so keen on them either. The huge buff Orpington observed her with murder in his eye. Siobhan was never quite sure why they had cockerels, but her mum reassured her that it was a deterrent to foxes. Siobhan wasn't so sure. Her mum raised income by delivering fresh eggs daily to the local corner shop and through the honesty box she'd set up at the side of the road. The latter method often proved to be a lost leader as, all too frequently, the honesty part of it failed and they would find someone had swiped both the eggs and the money from the box, leaving it empty. Her mum persisted. The local shop took 24 eggs daily and normally sold them all. But if there was a build-up and they weren't selling as many for any given reason, her mum was left with a glut. Siobhan had spent the morning giving Beau, their black Labrador, a 5 a.m. walk down to the river before the heat of the day kicked in, feeding him and the 6 cats and collecting the eggs from the previous day that had been abandoned due to her mum's accident. The treadle feeders they used to discourage rats had needed to be refilled with layers pellets and mixed corn, but that meant she had approximately 5 days' worth of feed in them, which was one less job to do daily. She cleaned out the housing units, the waterers, the goat's house and the donkey shed, which was the chore her mum had embarked on when her accident occurred. For Siobhan, it had proved a welcome distraction. By lunchtime, Siobhan was overheated and exhausted, and no, she'd not managed to work from home. There'd simply been too much to do, and too much on her mind to concentrate. Mucking out was mindless. With visiting her mum, Siobhan would have to catch up later that evening. Perhaps she'd even treat herself to a weekend glass of wine while she did so. She stepped into the cool, air-conditioned foyer of the hospital and made her way through the long corridors, using the stairs to go up one floor instead of the lift she knew would be stuffy. She realised just how much hard work her mum put into keeping the rescue animals. All of them had come into their lives almost by accident. Her mum couldn't help saving lost souls. They'd rescued 6 chickens first and continued to do so, building their flock. The donkeys had been abandoned when an old man died with no one else to care for them. In addition, her mum also ran a soup kitchen she'd set up for the homeless. She never turned away waifs and strays. She grew a wealth of food in their fenced-off allotment, and instead of profiting from it, she put most of it into supplying those in more need. Siobhan had never questioned her mum's desire to look after the homeless. She never had to cook for herself. It wasn't that she was incapable, but her mum always had an evening meal prepared when she arrived home from work. The freezer was laden with every kind of meal she could think of, all of them meals for 2. She'd had spaghetti bolognese the previous day, and would again that night, instead of the Sunday roast her mum would normally cook. The following 2 days would be fish pie. She didn't want to deplete the freezer too much, though, as her mum wouldn't be capable of standing in the kitchen for some time once she was allowed home after the hip replacement she'd been about to have the previous afternoon. Knowing her mum, she'd insist on cooking. You couldn't keep a good woman down. When she'd called the hospital early that morning, expecting to be able to visit, the sister on the ward had advised her to leave it until mid-afternoon before she came to visit. She thought nothing of it, until she pushed through the doors into the heat of the orthopaedic ward, where the air conditioning appeared to be switched off, to find the bed her mum was allocated the day before empty. Her heart lurched. Not just empty, but cleared out. Chapter 2. Present day, Sunday 30th of June, 2024, 4 p.m. Siobhan. The sick feeling didn't subside, even when the nurse at the desk quietly informed her that her mum had been put into a side room. Why? The nurse's soft voice penetrated her concern. "I'm sorry, Miss Martin. Siobhan Martin. Siobhan." The nurse edged out from behind the nurse's station, manoeuvring around the meds trolley to come and stand beside her. Her features calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes that Siobhan couldn't quite place. Concern? Apprehension? "They're just in with her now, making her comfortable." She chinned towards a private room at the end of the long line of bays. A trace of worry made Siobhan's stomach clench once more. "Why? What's going on? Can I see her?" "Yes, of course. Let me check if they're ready for you. Mr. Carmichael is just doing his rounds. He'd like to see you." "Me? He wants to see me?" Was that the normal way of things? Siobhan had no memory of either her or her mum ever going to their GP's surgery, let alone the hospital. She'd no idea what the process was. "Would you like to come through to the office to wait for him? Can I get you a cup of coffee? Tea? The heat in the ward swarmed over her, and Siobhan pressed her fingers against her lips as she pushed down on panic that threatened to surge up and overwhelm her. "Water, if you have some, please." She allowed the nurse to guide her into a tiny box room, jammed with equipment and paperwork, a small computer screen almost swallowed by the piles of files surrounding it. She sank into a plastic chair and allowed the quiet of the room to settle her. It wasn't silent, but the noise and movement from the main ward were muffled, blending into white noise, so she found the time to think. Was this normal? She'd not noticed in her brief look around other visitors being taken to one side. They all appeared to be perched on the edge of chairs next to their loved ones, in bays of beds that ran the entire length of the corridor. Siobhan watched through the wide window, overlooking the corridor, as nurses hustled from bed to bed, bay to bay, under pressure and understaffed. Her heart skipped a beat as a tall, regal-looking gentleman let himself out of the side room that the nurse had indicated to Siobhan. She wanted to spring to her feet and rush down the corridor to him, demanding to know what was going on, but there was nothing about his demeanour that invited that. Wariness etched deep lines around steel-grey eyes as he made his way towards her. The slight bow of his shoulders indicated the exhaustion he must feel. Not a young man, Siobhan wondered at the toll the job had taken on him and why he would stay so long. He definitely looked over retirement age to her. COVID had managed to dispose of so many of the experienced medical profession, either by killing them, maiming them, or simply making them give up, as their eyes were open to a whole new world of horrors. Her mum wasn't there because of COVID, merely an accident. Normally a healthy woman, Siobhan had been surprised at the ease at which her mum's hip had snapped. She'd rerun the moment over and over in her head, but still she couldn't get the sound of it from her mind. Siobhan surged to her feet as the consultant stepped up to the door. Her breath halted as he paused, his hand on the door handle, while a nurse in a navy uniform waylaid him. Possibly a sister. Siobhan didn't really care. She wanted to see him. She wanted answers. The grim set of his mouth should have been warning enough, as the doctor slipped into the small room and made way for the sister to accompany him as she sidled in behind him. But Siobhan held on to the hope that still gripped her. How bad could it be? Would she need to get help in until her mum was back on her feet? She was going to have to work from home. It wasn't the easiest when she had to schedule appointments with clients and show potential buyers around homes. Nothing mattered other than her mum. She closed her eyes and envisioned her mum, weak and pallid, as she lay in the dirt in the blazing sunshine. Her heart quivered. Her eyes popped open as the doctor spoke. "Miss Martin, I'm Mr. Carmichael. Do take a seat." Finding herself in such an enclosed area with two other bodies, Siobhan was relieved to melt down into the plastic chair. Mr. Carmichael perched himself on the edge of another chair, while the sister stood with her back to the door, hands linked at her waist. Siobhan had never been in hospital before, barely ever been to a GP surgery. The man in front of her exuded a confidence that was almost overpowering in the enclosed space. He leaned forward in his chair, eyes direct, so she felt obliged to burble. "Is my mum okay?" "Miss Martin, when your mother came into the hospital through A&E, it was our understanding that she'd broken her hip, having taken a fall." Siobhan nodded, although she felt like she was missing a key element of their conversation. "Yes." "Were you there?" "Yes." "Did you notice anything out of the ordinary? Does your mother take a tumble on a regular basis?" "No." She shook her head again, completely at a loss as to where he was going with the conversation, aware of the woman who stood at the door, her arms now folded under her breasts, closed in, uncomfortable. "My mum is really very tough, sturdy." Her mum might not like that description, but it was true. She lugged small bales of straw and hay and 25-kilogram bags of feed on a daily basis, as though they weighed nothing. She may be small, but she was strong, muscular. Siobhan fidgeted in the hard chair. What the hell was going on? Is something wrong? Mr. Carmichael gave a long pull of breath, almost an inward sigh. "Miss Martin." "Siobhan." She was rarely addressed by her surname. "Siobhan." His brows drew together. "I'm very sorry to tell you that your mother's condition is more complex than we have first believed." She drew in a breath to ask a question, but he raised one finger and stopped her mid-thought. "It's my opinion that your mother's hip was already broken by the time she hit the ground. I believe the cause of the break was not simply the fall, but what came before." Siobhan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" But she knew in her heart there was something wrong. It was those thoughts that had kept her awake all night. The sound of the crack as she hefted a bag of feed and then the fall, not the other way around. She'd thought she'd imagined it. Sweat broke out on her forehead. A sick anticipation curdled her stomach. "I'm afraid that once we started your mother's operation, we discovered something far worse than a straightforward break in her hip, and took the decision to bail out. Sadly, your mother sustained the injury because she already has a very serious condition. We've conducted tests that we're awaiting the results for, but until then, we can do nothing further. We need far more detailed analysis before we continue, for your mother's safety." He paused, sympathy lurking in those steely eyes. "We're looking at whether this is secondary cancer. We are currently conducting tests to see whether and where the primary cancer might be." Cancer? Cancer? Siobhan raised a hand to her forehead. Her head swam with the overload of information and rush of fear-induced adrenaline. Her mum had cancer. Cancer that had broken her hip bone. Wasn't that the hardiest bone? Siobhan pulled in a breath, but it stuck in her chest. A burning pain lodged. "I don't understand. Cancer? My mum has cancer." She could barely process it. The words scraped like sand on her tongue. "It appears so." Mr. Carmichael nodded. The sympathy in his eyes seemed to dissipate and was replaced instead with professional determination. "We're conducting tests to see whether there's a primary cancer, as bone cancer per se is quite rare. We're looking at the possibility of it originating in her lungs. It may seem a tenuous link, but bone fractures are not uncommon when lung cancer metastasizes." Lungs? She's never smoked. Not to her knowledge in any case. Mr. Carmichael shook his head. "It doesn't necessarily mean she won't get cancer. It could be anything." A cynical smile quirked his lips. "Life is not always fair. I've found over time that there's no rhyme or reason to cancer. Sometimes the healthiest living people are struck with it. Your mother may be one of those." "How?" "Has she shown any recent signs of being ill? Tiredness, loss of weight, lack of energy, interest?" Siobhan's chest squeezed. She should have noticed. She should have realised. Her mum had dropped pounds recently, delighted after being plump and square for so long, Siobhan wanted to put her head in her hands, but stared at Mr. Carmichael instead, as she thought of how gaunt her mum had looked recently, and she'd done nothing, said nothing. Yes. The word fell from her lips. Her shoulders sagged into the curve of the chair back. Without results, I can't confirm this, but there's a possibility that what we found has metastasized from elsewhere into her bones, which is why her hip crumpled. That's the most likely scenario. Until we get the results of the blood tests and scans we've carried out today, we can't know for sure. Siobhan let out a soft moan. I'm sorry. He reached for her, placed a cool hand on the burning flesh of her upper arm. Tears pricked the back of her eyes at that one small show of sympathy, and she choked out the next words. Did you fix it? Her hip. Did you manage to fix it? Mr. Carmichael leaned forward and shook his head. Sorry. As I mentioned earlier, we decided our best course of action when we saw what we were dealing with was to bail out immediately and give her a better chance once we understand what challenges we are facing. Currently, your mother is being kept comfortable. There is nothing we can do to fix her hip until we find out how much damage there is to her connecting bones. Once we know what margins we have to take, we can resume. Be warned, though, she has what we classify as post-operative delirium, caused partially after the fall when she became severely dehydrated. Her body is refusing to take on fluids, despite an intravenous drip. She is very confused. We are doing all we can to assist her, but I think it would be wise to prepare yourself for the worst. Worst? What could be worse than this? What could possibly be more terrible than being in this room, listening to this doctor? Death. Death could be worse. Chapter 3. Present day, Sunday, 30th of June, 2024, 8:55 p.m. Siobhan. The soft sigh of her mum's breath was the only sound in the darkening room. Siobhan had sat by her bed for hours, until the light began to fade. The soft whisper of respect as nurses came and went, from time to time, changing her mum's catheter or taking her blood pressure. In all that time, her mum had never so much as opened her eyes. Her cool fingers never gave an acknowledging squeeze of her daughter's gentle clasp. Sleep had to be the best way, but Siobhan wanted her to know she was there, to acknowledge her presence. She glanced at her watch. She needed to go soon. The healthcare workers had brought her coffee and water, but she declined the package of sandwiches made with thin, plastic-looking bread. She was starting to regret it, but she needed to go home to feed all the animals and bed them down for the night in any case. She could get herself something then, freshen up and return later. Mr. Carmichael had said she could stay as long as she wanted. They'd find her a comfortable chair. She peered around in the dusky light. That all depended on what their idea of comfy was, with the single plastic-coated chair in the corner of the room made for hygiene, not comfort. She could always bring a throw and a pillow back with her, a book, a flask of real coffee, and a snack for later in the night, if she wanted to keep awake. Siobhan slipped her fingers away and felt a slight resistance from her mum's hand. Real? Or was it imaginary? Her own desperate need for acknowledgement, awareness. With her breath held, she leaned closer, coming to her feet so she could lean over and study her mum's features. Slack-mouthed, her mum's sallow skin lay in folds around her chin. Something Siobhan had never noticed, never considered. Her mum wasn't old, had never acted anything but robust, healthy. No longer healthy. Her bruised eyelids flickered. Mum? Siobhan touched the cool arm that lay on top of the white sheet and gave it a gentle rub. Her mum's eyes slit open. Who are you? The stilted murmur came through pale, dry lips. Mum, it's me, Siobhan. She gave the arm a gentle squeeze, concerned when her mum blinked. Blank eyes stared at her. Siobhan? I don't know a Siobhan. Mum? Mum, it's me. Siobhan gave her mum's arm another gentle squeeze, a prompt for her to recognise her. The woman stilled, her focus turning sharp, as though a light had been turned on inside her head. The door swung open and light from the corridor slashed through the room. Her mum squeezed her eyes closed against the intrusion and rolled her head away. Siobhan turned to confront the interloper. Mr. Carmichael stepped inside and snapped the door closed behind him. My apologies. I've had an emergency to deal with and never got to catch up with you or your mother. Confused, Siobhan stared at him as he leaned over to click on a small lamp over the bed, throwing her mum's features into shadows from above that emphasised the hollows in her cheeks and the bruised look under her eyes, giving her a sinister death mask. He glanced at her mum and then leaned his back against the wall. His face took on a haggard appearance, most likely down to the long hours he'd already worked. He took in a long breath before he spoke. I'm sorry to tell you that my earlier thoughts on your mother's condition have been confirmed. Sister will come in shortly and give you any information you need and answer your questions. Was he implying that he didn't want to answer her questions now? He pushed away from the wall. His face looked gaunt, making Siobhan wonder how many times he delivered this news in his career. Pity stirred in her, because it was easier to think of the doctor right now than face her own desperate situation and her mum's diagnosis. If she could throw herself across her mum's frail body, Siobhan would. She held back. Respect for her mum and a deep resolve not to destroy the woman by burdening her with her own terror. Terror of losing her. Surely it was best if her mum never even knew. Could they let her slip away without fear? What? She could barely find the words. What's her prognosis? How long? She glanced at her mum's listless body, eyes a moment ago open, now closed, face slack. Was it rude to discuss her condition while she lay there? What if she could hear? Mr. Carmichael must have been of the same mind as he opened the door and stepped into the corridor, gliding his hand through the air as an invitation for her to join him. Siobhan hadn't realised how much she was shaking until she pressed icy fingers to her lips. I'm sorry. I should make myself clear. We've had results back on the bloods we took earlier, and the news is not good. Unfortunately, when your mother fell, we believe she may have suffered a blow to her kidney, or kidneys. She nodded. Could it get any worse? Siobhan pictured her mum on the hard ground, partially on her side. When Siobhan had tried to roll her, her mum had cried out in pain. The only thing Siobhan could do was run inside, phone the ambulance, grab a pillow for under her mum's head, and the umbrellas to shade her. It had taken 45 minutes for the ambulance to arrive, and probably another 45 until they decided they had her stabilised enough to move her. That, together with the dehydration she suffered, because they took too long to get to her, he shook his head. Not necessarily. It will be a combination of factors. The blow to her kidneys, the heat, the damage to her hip, shock. Sadly, it all adds up to her being a very poorly patient right now. We will do our best to make her comfortable, but it is a matter of whether her body has had enough. Enough? She may just give up. Siobhan shook her head. My mum is a fighter. The doctor gave her a grim smile. Even the toughest of people sometimes succumb to the elements conspiring against them. Siobhan's brow twitched into a frown. How long? She didn't really want to ask. Dr. Carmichael shook his head. It's not as simple as that. If we can stabilise her bloods, then she could be around for some time. Otherwise, he shrugged. Otherwise what? A piercing sound in the quiet hallway had Siobhan jumping, but the doctor automatically raised his hand and glanced at his bleep. Tiredness etched deep into his features. Looks like I won't be heading home for a while. He reached out a hand and gave her elbow a gentle squeeze. I'll see what I can do to make her comfortable. Siobhan watched the back of his white coat recede up the empty corridor, her chest squeezing at the thought of her mum leaving her. Oh, God. What was she going to do? How would she cope? She loved this woman so much. She'd never even given thought to her mum's mortality. Her mum had always been such a strong woman, always known what to do, so independent. She'd moved them around England for the past 3 decades, until they'd settled 4 years ago at their small holding in Wales, their forever home, as her mum called it. Well, it may well be forever, for her mum. She squeezed her eyes closed against the threat of tears and took in a long breath, letting it slide back out again before she was ready to face her mum. She slipped in through the door, this time noticing immediately her mum's focused eyes upon her. Forcing a smile, she stepped close to the bed. "Hello, Mum." Puzzlement slid over the woman's pale face, and she withdrew the hand Siobhan reached out to touch. "Who are you?" What had they told her? That her mum had some kind of delirium, post-operative. "It's me, Siobhan, your daughter." The papery skin over her mum's forehead twitched into a doubtful scowl. She settled her head more comfortably against the crackly medical pillow, letting out a low groan of pain as she adjusted her body. Her eyes, when they met Siobhan's, turned shifty, something Siobhan hadn't ever noticed before. "I don't have a daughter. I can't have children." A small puff of disbelief carried on the air as Siobhan let out a laugh. "I am your daughter." "No, you're not." The vitriol in her mother's tone had Siobhan rearing her head back, as though she'd been struck. What the hell? Siobhan reached for the call button resting on the bed. Her mum's hand snatched at hers, fingernails digging deep into Siobhan's skin, with a vicious intent she'd not imagined her mum had. The woman's eyes narrowed as she reached up with her other hand, grasping Siobhan's long hair and pulling her face down to meet hers. "You stupid little bitch!" Siobhan gasped. She'd never heard such words from her mum's lips. Only when the paramedic tried to move her, and that surely was understandable in the heat and the pain. Her mum wasn't like that, though. Her gentle, sweet, caring mum. "You don't deserve a baby. How could you even let him treat you like that? How could you leave that poor baby to weep and wail while he—" Her mum tossed Siobhan's hair away, hatred flitting across her face. Shock took hold, and Siobhan took a hasty step away from the bed, barely able to recognise her own mother. She pressed herself against the closed door, while she stared at the frail old woman in the bed. Where had that come from? The glare in her mum's eyes struck terror through her soul. This woman wasn't her mum, was she? There was no resemblance to her. Siobhan raised her hand to press it against her thundering chest. Oh, God! What was she supposed to do? The spiteful glare was still there, and as Siobhan moved, the woman in the bed bared her teeth at her. Siobhan fumbled for the door handle and stumbled from the room, fleeing the hospital as fear gripped her.
Chapter 4. 50 years earlier, 1974. Grace. I raise my hand and smooth shaking fingers over the hot welt on my cheek. I hate my mum. Isn't a mother the one person in life you should be able to rely on? For love? For life? For protection? Not my mum. She's an evil bitch from hell. I know. You're shocked that an 11-year-old child could even form that thought in their innocent minds. But my mind is not so innocent. Not now. Not since her latest boyfriend arrived. Kev, she calls this one. A car mechanic she picked up at the local pub one night. Greasy Kevin the sleazebag, I call him. That's what earned me the slap on the cheek. No. Actually, that's not quite true. It was when I told her, Uncle Kevin, that's what she said I should call him, the sleazebag, had asked me to sit on his knee while she worked the night shift at the local mental asylum, or madhouse, as she calls it. Mum is an attendant. She cares for poor, tortured souls, she tells me. I find that so hard to believe. Not the poor, tortured souls bit, but that she cares for them. She's never cared for a soul in her life. No one other than herself. Not unless it's for money, in any case. So, when I mentioned he slid his hand up the inside of my thigh and tried to slip his fingers under the elastic of my knickers, she refused point blank to believe me. Like I could make that kind of thing up. These are not the kind of things children know of. Not unless they've been through it. Grace, you horrible child, she sputters, through eyes filled with crocodile tears. Spiteful, that's what you are. You'll do anything to stop me having a relationship, won't you? It's not her relationship I'm worried about. It's the relationship Kevin would like to have with me I'm more concerned with. I shrug. He's a dirty old man, a pervert. Where did you hear such a thing? You're a lying little bitch, she spits at me. That's because she had no idea Kevin was in our house with me last night, and truth be told, she's dead shocked. Her shock shouldn't impact negatively on me. It always has, though. She's left me alone while she works the night shift for as long as I can remember. My first memory was when I was around 4, maybe 5. After all, I have no real timeline to base it on, apart from I'd not long started school. Prior to that, I think she drugged me at night, so I wouldn't wake up and realise I was alone. I believe now she was probably slipping me meds she obtained from the old folk where she worked. It's not unheard of. Bad parenting, it was called back then. Abuse, I think the term is now. Or neglect. I've heard the teachers talk about it at school. It amounts to the same thing when you leave your child alone and they accidentally set fire to the house, like little Gregory Charles did last summer. His face is still wrinkled from where the fire melted his skin, and one of his eyes droops downward onto his left cheek. They say he'll never get any better. Since then, I've been very careful not to turn the gas fire on when I'm alone. I'd never been scared about being alone before, not until I started to read the newspaper Mum brought home after work. I read every page of it, sucking in knowledge, desperate to know more about the world and its dangers. Like the child on the news who broke their neck falling down the darkened stairwell, or the one who sliced open a finger as they cut a sandwich for themselves with stale bread and rancid margarine their dad had left them while he worked. All of those factors fall into the same melting pot. Unless one of these things happens to me, she's safe from the authorities, as she calls them. Anyway, no one knew. No one asked. No one cared. Except at school when they wanted to know why I seemed so tired all the time, which was when she stopped giving me meds. She wrapped my hair in her clenched fist, pulling me in close, and explained that if I woke in the night and made a sound, she would slap me silly the next day. She drilled into me that the authorities would come and take me away, put me in a home with other naughty little children, and I didn't want that. Did I? Looking back, it probably would have been the best course of action. The result, for me. After all, I might have ended up adopted by the most incredible parents. Ones with money, luxury yachts, and plenty of love. Of all those things, love is the most important. I crave love. Not the kind greasy Kevin is willing to offer me. Even at the age of 11, I know that's so wrong. It's not love. It's something dark and dirty. I don't want it. I don't want his motor oil-stained fingers anywhere near me. I'd leapt from his lap when he'd pulled me as I walked past where he sat on the settee the night before and darted upstairs, skinny legs flying until I crashed into the bathroom. I'd shot the bolt across the door as I slammed it closed, so he couldn't get to me. No matter how much he pleaded, he threatened, he cajoled, his voice low and gruff, so the neighbours couldn't hear through our paper-thin walls. Short of knocking the door down, there was no way he could get me, and if he had, that would definitely have been a red flag to anyone who cared to ask. Not Mum. She probably wouldn't care even then, provided her lovely Kev continued to hang around. The neighbours may have had something to say about it. In fact, that was the main reason he took off. It was me who raised the alarm when I yelled, "Go away! Leave me alone!" I banged on the dividing wall with the side of my fist, like Mum does when they play music too loud. The neighbour had hammered back, shouting, "What the fuck is going on in there? Quiet down, or I'll have the pigs on you." Now, Kevin is gone, and hopefully will never return. That's my fault, according to Mum. I've deprived her of adult companionship, of a man who she loved. She never loved him, but she did use him. At least he'd managed to do a few DIY jobs around the house before he showed his real self, the evil inside. Now he is gone. Not because she told him to go. She'd have clung on to him despite his liking for younger girls. No, he left because he wrongly believed she'd kill him. Of course she wouldn't. It was all my fault. I must have flirted with him, given him the come-on, according to Mum. I have no idea what a come-on is, but I can take a guess, and that was never my game. Not now, not ever. I don't play games. I refuse to meet her gaze as I cradle my burning cheek with an icy hand. After all, what will I gain from that? She's never going to believe me. She never has. I'm just a nuisance. She never wanted me, as she reminds me all too often. Never in public, though. Now I'm getting older. I notice that. She's different when we're in company. There's a mask she has that slides into place as soon as there is another person around. I wonder if this is the mask she uses at work. Does it slip momentarily if she's in charge of one of the old folk? Does she give them a mean pinch when no one is looking? I wouldn't put it past her. In the silence, she lights a cigarette, and I feel her gaze on me, astute and searching. It's not something I'm used to from her. It makes me want to curl up in a tight ball as her narrowed gaze rakes over me. She's assessing me, as though she's only just seen me for the first time. I wonder why. Then I notice the glint of something in her eyes. It's jealousy. I swear it is. She can't actually disguise it. But why is she jealous? Is it because she no longer sees herself as young and pretty, and she's realised I'm just starting on that journey? That men soon will be looking at me, with my tiny breasts that are just starting to bud. I know this because the boys at school already nudge each other in the ribs and stare at girls' chests with knowledge in their eyes that's come all too soon. When she's not at work, I watch as she spends hours in front of the mirror, smoothing out fine lines she imagines she sees from the corners of her eyes, and that deeper one that has formed between her eyebrows. Age is not responsible for that. Discontentment is. The scowl deepens as she stares at me. It won't be long until I'm a teenager. My skinny frame will fill out, and will she then have even more trouble snagging boyfriends for herself? Will they always have one eye on me? I don't know how old she was when she had me. She's certainly younger than most of the parents at school. She says I took away her childhood. I ruined her life. She could have been married now, but what man wants to burden himself with someone else's child? Burden. I know that word well. She uses it often. I once suggested that it wasn't my fault she couldn't keep her legs together. I'd heard one of the parents say that about her as they picked their child up from school, while I made my way home alone. I earned myself a slap that time too. She's fond of reminding me that she never wanted children. She wished she'd got rid of me instead of going through with my birth. That was the other thing the parent had said that day as she walked home behind me. The only reason that woman didn't have an abortion was because she thought she'd get free housing. Shame she didn't know who the father was. She could tap him up for some money too. I don't quite understand the mechanics of how a woman gets a baby inside her. School showed us how a plant reproduces, but for the life of me I can't translate that image into what happens with girls and women. I mean, where does the stamen come from to insert in a pistil? Evidently, according to that woman, my mum collected lots of stamens. And if you insert a stamen into the pistil, you can't blame anyone else for the fact that you end up pregnant. Knocked up was the phrase she used. With each day that passes, I know how much my mum detests my presence. When I have children, I'll let them know every day of their lives that they are loved with every part of my being. They will be so assured that I wanted them, that they'll never doubt for a single moment my love for them. Never.
Chapter 5. Present day, Sunday, 30th of June, 2024, 9:25 p.m. Siobhan. Pain squeezed at Siobhan's chest until she could barely breathe. The cherub-faced nurse, with cheeks ruddy through effort as she dashed around, had still afforded Siobhan the time to explain that her mum was suffering from post-operative delirium and that she shouldn't take it to heart. How could she not? Delirious or not, her mum had denied her existence. Surely that wasn't right. Did delirious people then declare quite coldly that they had never been able to have children? She didn't know. She'd never been in this situation before, never had friends who had been. Truth be known, she didn't have very many friends. With moving around as much as they had in her earlier years, those bonds that others seemed to form with kids they grew up with weren't there. Siobhan got along fine with the other girls at work and some of the lads. She had noticed, though, that the married guys were always a little wary of her, or they were wary because their wives were. They'd no reason, except Siobhan was attractive. She was aware that she was and exuded a confidence in herself that had been instilled by her mum. Her mum, who told her almost on a daily basis how beautiful she was, how clever she was, how loved she was. Tall with long legs she considered to be her best feature. As one boyfriend once told her, they go right up to her arse. Although she'd had a number of compliments about her eyes too. Siobhan wasn't vain, but aware. She knew men found her desirable. Women too. Not necessarily in a sexual way, but in that sideways glance women often do when they admire another woman's features. Never one to slather on makeup, she only applied a touch of tinted moisturiser, especially this time of year. She had 1,000 freckles scattered across her cheekbones and down her nose that insisted on joining up as soon as the sun came out. Less like a dot-to dot and more like a map of the world smudged across her face. There was no point trying to hide them with foundation, because once people saw her without makeup, they were shocked. Aaron was. He could hardly be called her ex because he was never her boyfriend in the first place. They never quite got that far, despite her misguided belief that they were stepping towards a permanent relationship. What the fuck's happened to your skin? he had asked the first and last time he woke up in her bed. She'd been awake for a whole hour before Aaron had stirred that morning, debating whether he'd had a good time the night before. Back then, she wasn't massively experienced in the area of sex, partly because Siobhan and her mum had moved frequently, giving her little opportunity to strike up relationships, and partly because her mum made sure she was well educated about the pitfalls of unprotected sex. And, to be truthful, had probably frightened the living crap out of her, which made her unsure of herself. What she did have was every confidence in her looks. Her mum raised her to believe that everyone is beautiful. She'd stared in the mirror after Aaron had left. Her skin was as smooth as silk. She knew that. There wasn't a spot or a blemish on it. Because her freckles were not blemishes, and she was damned if she was about to allow some freaking egotistical, sex-mad, self-professed perfectionist get her down. No way. Her mother had taught her better, instilled in her an inner confidence. Siobhan had booted him out of the door before he'd even registered the insult she reeled with, as she'd quickly buried it beneath the annoyance she'd let surge forward. Since then, she has shown her freckles loud and proud. She had a redhead skin, but her hair was more of a strawberry blonde than red, her eyes like melted toffee, as her mum always said. Siobhan had asked, when she was little, why she looked so unlike her mum, who was short and plump, with eyes such a brilliant blue that people frequently commented on them. It must come from your dad's side. They say redheads run through the male side of the family. Only she wasn't a redhead, not technically, and in any case, who was her dad? Just a passing ship, I'm afraid. I don't even know his name, or how to contact him. Of course, her mum had never told her until she was much older. Did she really not know who he was? Or had she lied?
Chapter 6. 45 years earlier, 1979. Grace. For my 16th birthday, I wanted a little party. Not much, just some of the girls from school. None of the boys. They were at that awful stage, too young to realise what complete idiots they were being, and too big to put in their place. My skin is dull and greasy, and I've those permanent little whiteheads in the creases of my nose and chin. Some of the girls say to pop them, and others say if you do, the poison goes back into your skin and you just get more. I pop them, because I can't be like Karen, who seems to grow them until they're so enormous they burst, throwing out horrible white pus and blood. It's disgusting, but she claims it's far better for her skin. I don't agree. I find it revolting. Maybe, if Mum gave me something more than soap and water, my skin wouldn't be so bad. Oh, she makes sure I have the basics. Soap, water, although not always hot. I hate the smell of the carbolic soap she snaffles from work. After I use it, my skin feels like it's being stretched over my cheekbones. Sort of squeaky clean, but dry, so if I pull a face, it feels like it might crack. Until around lunchtime, when it gets all oily again, especially in the heat. When Mum's at work, I slip into her room and sneak a tiny amount of Pond's cold cream. I can't take much, as I'm sure she'll notice and beat the living crap out of me. But if I smooth my finger across the same pattern in the cream as her finger made, then it's okay, until she comes to the end of the jar, and then I have to wait for her to buy a new one, tolerating my dry, parched skin in between times. She buys the cheapest shampoo on the market, and I have to tug a comb through my thick hair while it's still wet. Or maybe she steals that too, as they provide it for some of their workers because of the type of place she works in. Obviously, they've never caught her stealing. Unlike the asylum, which dismissed her when they caught her with a bag full of residents' toiletries and a small amount of cash. Of course, she never told me that, but one of the girls at school let me know. telling me how lucky I was that it was her dad who caught my mum. Otherwise, she could have ended up in prison. I think she was under the impression I should be grateful. School uniform. Although it's second-hand, cheap shoes she sometimes manages to pick up from one of the charity shops. She's good at buffing them up. I'll give her that. Apparently, she'd had to polish her dad's and brother's shoes every Sunday when she was younger. She only did them once for me each time she brought home a new pair. The latest ones are too big, and I have to jam toilet paper in the toes so they don't slip off. She doesn't care. She says I'll grow into them. I'm not about to grow any more. Well, I hope not in any case, although I'd love to be a little taller. According to my biology lessons, I'm pretty much fully grown height-wise, but the chances are I'll plump out, and what 16-year-old wants to do that, hey? Especially when they're already curvy. The bras she gives me are ill-fitting too. She never measures me, merely gives me her old bras. When I was 12, they fit, although mostly they were inappropriate for a 12-year-old, if you get my drift. Horrible, thin material and totally see-through. Not only that, but if I didn't wear my burgundy jumper on top, my nipples could be seen so clearly through my thinning, dingy white school uniform shirt, something the boys found an absolute hoot. We are not the same size. To give Mum her due, she's short like me, but instead of the voluptuous curves I have, she's trim, with pert breasts that looked pretty good in those pointed wonder bras. Mine do not. They spill over the top and wobble like the sickly blancmange we have for pudding at school. The boys do that stupid nudging and sniggering, especially in the summer, when we no longer have to wear ties and we open the top 2 buttons on our shirts. Some of the girls let it all out there, big and brazen in their pure white bras that proudly take them up a whole size, flaunting themselves with the 3rd button on their shirts undone. Me, not so much. I don't want that kind of attention. I've never wanted it. Not since I discovered how much Mum's various boyfriends lech over me. It's gross. Mum? She looks at me over her shoulder as she slips a sandwich into her bag for her lunch. I'm lucky. I have really good lunches at school, and a bottle of milk every afternoon. She works full-time with her new job, and she's on a shift rota, which means sometimes she works days. I asked what she actually does in there, but she simply shrugs. Everything no one else wants to do. I think she's a cleaner in a factory. It's a rubber company. Apparently makes the rubber extrusion that goes around windscreens in cars and doors to freezer lorries. She always stinks when she comes home, sort of a bitter smell of hot rubber. She's been quite well off lately as some fat git, she calls him, has started paying her attention. He's the finance director. She comes home with lavish boxes of chocolates and the odd half-empty bottle of wine, the rest of which, I can only assume, she consumed with him in some seedy hotel. She hints at that. Not seedy, but she'll talk about this hotel and that. I'm hoping she doesn't bring him home. Although I suspect she won't, as it sounds like this one is married. There've been a couple of married men, but mostly divorced or widowed. I think she still holds out hope that one of them will marry her and whisk her away from this sad life she leads. Whisk her away from me, so she can deny she ever gave birth to me. I would never feel like that about a baby of mine. Never make them feel the way she does with me, as though I'm not wanted. I know I'm not wanted. It was only 2 years ago I found out her age, when she celebrated her 30th birthday with some loser or another who bought her a cake. 30. I was 14 then. I thought at first she was having them on. 30. Jeez. That made her 16 when she had me. She was my age now when she gave birth. That doesn't bear thinking about. I can think of nothing worse than having a baby to look after. No wonder she can't stand me. I've cramped her style all my life. She thinks this latest guy is going to give her a chance in the accounts department. She says she's good with numbers. She certainly knows how to fiddle any kind of cash system, not to mention her benefits. I know she claims them. Mum, can I have some friends around? No. She never even gives the question a moment to sink in. Her mouth just spews out the word. It frequently does. No. It's an automatic response to every single request I have. It's my birthday, though. She narrows her eyes. I don't normally have any comeback to her automated response. Not these days. Not since I was about 11 years old and learned to keep my mouth shut. My voice is soft, coaxing when I try again. I'm 16. 16 is special. Her lips compress. 16, huh? When I was 16, I was pregnant with you. You weren't entirely legal. It wasn't me who wasn't entirely legal, but my mum. Evidently, she'd had sex before the legal age of consent, which is 16 in the UK. I'm not sure I ever want sex. It's always seemed so sleazy to me. I would like a baby. Love a baby. But just not yet. I'd hate to think it would be as unloved as me. Her brow knits into a tight frown. She's not got wrinkles, more lines of discontent etched into her face. Her gaze cruises over me, assessing. 16. We'd better make sure you have a job lined up for when you finish school. I can't afford to keep you. You can stay as long as it takes you to stand on your own 2 feet, find a flat and get a job. I goggle at her. Panic slides its cold knife into my stomach. She's got to be kidding. Her face is deadpan. My mum has never joked about anything like that in my life. She's serious, just like she was when I was 12 and she decided to put me on the pill. I don't take it. She insisted, took me to the doctor and everything. Said she never wanted me to be burdened with a baby like she was. It made me feel funny, though, when I took it. I don't know how to describe it, but I could have bashed my head against the nearest wall. I didn't tell anyone. I just stopped taking it. She doesn't know. Never asks. I'm hardly in danger of getting pregnant, though. I've never had sex. Never want to. But I want to stay on at school, do my A-levels. I'm actually really good. I'm in the top set at school. They call it the grammar stream. I work hard. I have potential. That's what my teachers always tell me. Mum wouldn't know. She never comes to parents' evening. Somehow she always manages to wriggle out of it. I can see me fighting my way out of this shithole. Or at least I could, if only I was given the opportunity. She leans back against the sink, in front of grubby windows.